All right, we are at time, so I'm going to get started. My name is Ed Charbeneau. I'm a principal developer advocate for Progress Software. I primarily am focused on Blazor and our Telerik UI for Blazor component library. And today I'm going to talk about writing CSS for Blazor applications. There's kind of four main areas I've broken this down into. We'll talk a little bit about Sass, kind of what it is, why you should use it, that sort of thing, how to kind of use that in a .NET environment. We'll talk about Blazor's CSS Isolation, which is a feature of Blazor. What does it do exactly? How does that help or hurt us with our CSS? We'll talk about component scope. CSS Isolation and Sass both have their own style of component scoping or style scoping. And we'll talk about how to make those things work together in the best way possible. And then finally, we'll chat about frameworks a little bit. I'll give you my opinions on Tailwind and Blazor and how to use those and what they're good for and what some of their downsides may be. Talk a little bit about component libraries in that context as well. So one thing I want to point out before we get too much further is the slides that you're seeing are written in Blazor. This is a Blazor application as a presentation, and the techniques used in the talk were used to build the slides. So you can go on my GitHub page and grab the slide deck and kind of look through the components in the CSS and see how some of these things work. So first thing we're going to talk about is Sass. What exactly is Sass? If you've been doing web development in recent history, you might have come across Sass before. If you haven't heard of it, it is a superset language on top of CSS. So any CSS can be compiled and read by Sass, which is nice. Makes it easy migration path if you decide to move some code there. It was originally developed as a Ruby application. So you compile your Sass into CSS code, and the compiler was written in Ruby, and that was one of its kind of weaknesses for a while. It was kind of slow because it was written in Ruby. And over the years, they've migrated this to run on Dart, which is much, much faster than Ruby. So the Sass executable now is written in Dart. There's also a JavaScript version, which has the same kind of performance limitations. So if you're running Sass, you might want to switch over to the Dart compiled code so you can get that performance that you get from Dart. One thing that's really nice about Sass is it gives you features that CSS doesn't have. For a long time, CSS didn't have variables. It does now. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So Sass gave us variables years and years ago. It has nesting, which is something that is just now being spec'd out for CSS, and a lot of it is based on what Sass has done. It has modules, mix-ins, all sorts of stuff that gives us the ability to make modular maintainable CSS code. So there's a little example on the right-hand side here where we can use a module of Sass code, and we can use various variables and things from that module or some mix-ins, which are similar to functions that specifically output some CSS classes. When should you use something like Sass? Well, anytime you want to create a very wide-ranging theme for your application, Sass is a really great tool because it supports those variables and modules and things. So you can write really big code bases with Sass and keep those things maintainable. You can also find advanced color transformations and things that don't exist in CSS code that'll help you take a color, kind of map that to different shades and variations of that color, dynamically generate things. It's really good for styling anything that CSS can do. So any non-Blazor HTML code, which you still use a little bit of non-Blazor, non-component code inside of Blazor applications. There's some error messages and things like that that exist outside of Blazor that are rendered inside of the browser that aren't necessarily Blazor components. You can style those type of things. Up into the recent version of Bootstrap as well, it was nice to adopt Sass because Bootstrap was made with Sass. And if you use the Sass version of Bootstrap, you could cut out all of the parts of the library that you weren't using just by commenting out some variables inside of the Sass codebase. So it was a nice addition to Bootstrap. You could still do this, but Bootstrap isn't reliant on Sass anymore as of the latest version. One thing that a lot of .NET developers struggle with, in my opinion, when it comes to Sass, is how to actually compile their code. The reason for this is Sass was originally written before Blazor, and it was written at a time where all the major JavaScript frameworks were fighting for attention. So you got React and Vue and Angular and even jQuery. So all of the documentation that you see and all of the blog posts that you see talks about how to interact with those environments that typically use something like Gulp, Grunt, Webpack, or one of the CLIs for those specific frameworks. So when you look at .NET and doing Blazor applications, there's not a lot of blog posts and things that go along with how do I do this in a .NET world. If I'm building a Blazor application, I've chosen to not really use a lot of JavaScript in my application, and I may not have any NPM packages, nor do I possibly want them in my application. And you see all of this tooling that surrounds Sass, and it's all written in things that support this NPM chain of tools. Fortunately, the Dart binary is just an executable that you can run on your machine, and it takes an input and output. So you can script it with whatever tooling that you would like. You can install it very easily too, depending on what type of machine you're on, if it's Mac or if it's a Windows PC. You can use Choco or Brew. You can say Choco, which is the chocolatey package management tool. You can say Choco install Sass. You have Sass on your machine now, and all you have to do to run Sass is say Sass, give it the input Sass file, and declare an output, and it will generate those files for you. And you can also attach that process to MS Build. So you can just go inside of your project's configuration file, and you can put in those commands into your configuration file. So when it is building for debug or release, you can call the Sass compiler right from there. So you don't need Webpack. You don't need Gulp. You don't need any of these JavaScripty tools. All you have to do is install the Dart compiled Sass executable and just run it. And that Dart Sass is usually supported by most of your CI/CD pipelines as well. So when you're deploying things, you can do your compilation there, and it generally won't have any issue with that. So you don't need all that JavaScript stuff just to use Sass. If you really want to, you can use NPM to kick off those scripts, or you can use the JavaScript tooling as well, the JavaScript compilation of Sass, but again, it's going to be slower. So if you wanted to use Dart Sass and you're already using NPM and you just want to go ahead and use that to run your script, you can just set up a script right in your NPM or your package.json file and run it there. I prefer to have them in my MS Build, so if somebody grabs my repo, they don't even have to kick off any other services. But if you're already using NPM, so be it. Another tip here is there's a fantastic tool out there by Mads Christensen called NPM Task Runner. So if you are working on a project that does have NPM scripts that have to be run, you can download this extension for Visual Studio, and it has a nice GUI that you can go in, and it will pick up any of those scripts inside your package.json file, and you can just click on those inside of Visual Studio, and it will run them from within VS. That's a pretty nice extension to have. So Sass is, again, great for building themes that kind of scope to the entire application. But then if we're using Blazor, we have the ability to opt into something called CSS Isolation. And this gives us very tightly scoped component-based CSS. So what CSS Isolation does in Blazor is it dedicates a style to an individual page, view, or component. And what it's trying to avoid is a conflict in themes overriding each other. So where global styles can have conflicts, where somebody's using a selector that later gets applied from another component or some other style sheet in the application, we can run into something overriding our style by mistake. And this is what CSS Isolation really aims to fix. CSS Isolation is implemented in Blazor through the compiler. So what happens is in Blazor at build time, the compiler will scan our Blazor application. And it's going to look for our component file. And if there's a file that matches a naming pattern in Blazor, so if it's the same component name and the extension is .razor.css, the compiler is going to bundle those things together. And the way it does that is, for example, if I have an h1 tag in my component, Blazor or the compiler is going to alter the output of that component to where the h1 tag renders with this GUID style code at the end. So you'll see this b- attribute that's applied to my HTML. That gets added at compilation time, and you're not going to really know what that attribute ID is until it's rendered out to the browser. So you can't really go in and write overrides for the CSS that's created for this because of that GUID number. Now, it will also look at the CSS code that needs to be bundled with it, and it will apply that selector to that CSS code. So you can see the h1 tag on the right-hand side has the attribute on it. The h1 selector in my CSS code has a matching attribute selector applied to it. So only that h1 tag gets styled by that selector. So this is a very tightly scoped way of doing CSS, and this prevents people from overriding that style. There's no way to accidentally do it. You could possibly do it on purpose, but it's only going to work until you compile the application again, and it would break somebody from doing this on purpose. So this is very intentional. One of the downsides to it, in my opinion, is CSS Isolation kind of is a anti-pattern, because if you think of the words that CSS represents, it's cascading style sheets, and we're breaking the cascade when we isolate. So there's a pattern in the name CSS, and then we're going in with an anti-pattern, and we're saying we don't want the C in the CSS. We don't want to cascade anymore. So there's some places where you want to use this, and some places where it doesn't fit quite right. And then we'll talk about what scope is in this context too. So CSS Isolation is really nice if you're writing a component and you want some CSS that applies specifically to that one component and that one component only. If you have many components that share a style, then CSS Isolation probably isn't where that code belongs. That's better suited for something like Sass or just a generic CSS file that is not isolated. It also depends on the consumer of that component that you're creating. So does the consumer need to alter the style of this component? If you want to completely block them out of it, use CSS Isolation. If they need to, for my example, I work for Progress, and we have a library of 100 components that we sell to consumers. We want our consumers to be able to pick those components up and restyle them to match their business brand and theme, and etc. So we write all of our stuff in Sass, so our consumers can pick that up and just override some of the variables that are in that Sass code and retheme the entire suite of 100 plus components. So it all depends on what the consumer is in your scenario. I would advocate to try it on new projects if you haven't used it before. Find out where it's strong and it works with your products or your projects. But don't go into an existing project that's been written in CSS or Sass just for the sake of writing it the Blazor way, like rewrite everything. If it's not broke, don't fix it. There's also a feature in CSS Isolation called the deep selector. So this is something that we use when we need to kind of escape out of the isolation to style children that are under the parent of that component. So if I have, for example, a component that has a child content region to it, and I want to enforce a style on anything that's rendered in that child content region, I would do that with this deep selector. So that would tell me that, or tell Blazor that I want to reach into any child components and style those with that selector. And the way it does it is it changes the selector to where it will match things that are beneath the hierarchy of your component. Now, one rule of thumb here is if you see yourself using this deep selector a lot, specifically in the context of a single component, you've got 4 or 5 deep selectors in this one component. A lot of time what that's telling you is you probably need to abstract out another child component from that component. So you see those deep selectors, look at what they're being applied to. You might actually need some additional components. Pull that code out of your main component and put them in smaller components and kind of orchestrate that component as a whole using the child components. So a little bit of a code smell you can get there. So we've got CSS and Sass. CSS is great for managing the theme of your entire application. CSS Isolation is great for managing a component's very specific CSS code. Let's talk about how to choose where to put our CSS code, how to manage the scope of the CSS for our components. So this is going to choose where people are allowed to modify the theme of our components. I like to approach this from like a sliding scale. So we've got at 1 here, like global customization. There's a global set of CSS or Sass styles that developers can use to modify the look and feel of the components in any way they see possible. Okay, so there's no isolation here. There's room for conflicts and possible error, but it gives full control to the user of how they like to style those components. So the example, again, the stuff that we write at Progress, we're selling this to a big market. We want people to actually customize that to fit their needs. Then on the other end of the spectrum, on number 3, we've got minimal customization. So we're putting a file with every component, and that CSS isolation file is styling one component only. There's no global theme. If I want to make changes, I have to go touch that individual CSS file that belongs to each component. There's nothing particularly wrong with this approach. It is a little brittle, though, if, for example, your company gets acquired. That never happens, right? Your company gets acquired, and you've got a brand new brand that's brought into the business. And your boss comes to you, and they're like, well, you remember where everything was green? That needs to be this new color because that's what corporate said. So now you got to go and touch every file in that application and change your colors on every component that uses those colors. And that's not really great. That's a little bit too rigid. So number 2, this is what I'm going to talk about now. That's like this balanced customization. Like, where do we let people change the theme, and how do we do it in a controlled way? One way we can let developers control the theme of the components that we write is through CSS custom properties. I like to call these CSS variables. They are indeed properties, but they act like variables. So I like to say CSS variables. Most people know what you're talking about in the CSS world if you say that. Essentially, you can set a variable through this double dash syntax in CSS. So if I say double dash foo and I give it the color of black, then foo will now be black. To use that variable, I can choose any CSS property I want to attach this to. I'm going to use color here, for example, and then I use the var function, and I pass in foo, and foo is black, so color becomes black. So you basically can set or get a variable with that syntax. What's really cool, though, is CSS custom properties follow the cascade. So they follow the principle of cascading in CSS style sheets. So I can set a variable and scope it based on a selector. So I could set foo at the root level, and then later on I could set foo at the selector level of Baz in this example, and I could change the color to white, and anywhere inside of that hierarchy of Baz, that foo will represent white. At the root level, it's black. So I have scope here. So that's pretty nice. Another way of controlling the style within our components is through Blazor properties. So I could write very specific properties that I want to expose as an API surface to developers. And I could say, for this button, there's multiple themes that go along with it. And if you pass in a class to my button of default warning, danger, success, or info, it will then change the theme of the button accordingly. And all it's doing is passing in a string, and it concatenates that with a style class on the button. So this is a very limited way to let developers change the style of a component. So I have a fixed set of variations of this component that developers can choose from. So they don't have kind of overall access to retheme the component, but they can choose one of 5 different choices within the color palette. If I want to go beyond that and kind of set up a best of both worlds scenario where I'm controlling access through parameters, but I also have some CSS variables there to kind of give guidance and make things a little bit more global, I can do that as well. So what I'm going to do here in this example is kind of hijack the cascading effect of CSS variables. So at the root level, I can specify a color, and that's in the public global domain, right? So I've just used the literal public color as an example. You don't have to say public. I'm just using it there so you understand the scope of that variable. Within the component, I can use a selector at that level, so I can create a scope within the component itself using the same variables. So I'll say private color, because .NET developers, hopefully we understand public and private. At the root level, I have a public variable. At the component level, I have a private variable. And you'll see that I have the var selector, or var function, that's passing in the public color, and then there's a comma. After the comma is the default value. So what I can do here is at the private level, if nobody sets the root variable, I'll just take white as the color of that component. That could also be another variable. So I could have another private variable within that scope that's my default. And then it's also overridable at the global level if I want it to be. To make that take effect on the component, we will apply that at the element level. So at the element level, we can override even further any of the CSS variables we like. So we can actually pass that in as an inline style. And I wouldn't normally advocate for inline, inline styles, but in this case we're using variables, which lets us change the value of many CSS properties at one time. So if I pass in a color, for example, as a inline style, anywhere that this color is used within that CSS isolation, that color will be overridden. So I'm getting to set many values at one time just by passing this in as an inline style. So what that lets me do is I could even data bind this, and I could change CSS values on the fly at runtime. You could even bind, say, a color field to a color picker. And notice as I move around the color picker, let me make that just a little bit bigger. As I move around the color picker, we're getting the color from the color picker bound in real time to the component. Now, there's some additional code in here that takes the color that we've selected and inverts the color, and actually picks a foreground text color as well, so it's always contrasting the background. So this is kind of an ideal space to be in, where we've isolated things about the component that we don't want the user to change. It's always going to be this bubble shape. It's a circle, so that part's not exposed to the outside. There is a property for size and a property for color, and those map to CSS variables. We could set them at a global level, so all bubble instances are affected by it, or we could set them at the parameter level, so only that one single instance of that bubble is affected. So that gives us kind of the best of both worlds. We're right in the Goldilocks zone of styling our components there. So one thing that I think is really cool about this is you might have seen this theme changer down at the bottom. I use the same methodology here to change themes for the entire website. So at the very top level of the application, since this is running in the browser, I can jump in through my DOM inspector here and we can look at it. There is a very top level div here, and you can actually see the inline styles being applied to that wrapper element. So as our cascade effect here, anything that is under the hierarchy of that div that has all of those inline styles applied, those values will cascade down and overwrite any of the CSS variables that are there. So I'm applying all of the dark theme variables at the top of this div, and they get inherited by anything underneath. So if I have multiple styles, maybe I have a dark theme, or maybe I have users, you were in accessibility talk earlier possibly. High contrast is one of those accessibility modes that we might be in. So we could allow users that want high contrast to select that and be able to see our website better. I have a library that kind of helps apply styles, and it makes writing the code for something like that much, much easier to navigate. So in a lot of instances where you see properties or parameters being used to set CSS styles in a Blazor component, you will see like if statements or something like that. It will say if, some scenario, apply this CSS value. If it's false, then make it another value, and so on. There's all these if statements that you end up seeing in your Blazor components that pertain to style sheets. And this could be a class or an inline style. Doesn't make a difference. You see these if then or case statements, they can get kind of messy. So I built a library to help with this. And it's just a Fluent API that lets you define how you want that CSS class to be concatenated. So in this instance, we create a CSS builder. Default means that it's just going to have this one value by default. So it's literally item 1 would be the CSS value here. And then we can call add class. And when we call add class, we can pass in another static value, or we can say comma when and put in some kind of flag in there. So if somebody adds a parameter, maybe it's disabled. If disabled is true, then apply the disabled CSS class. And that makes it easier for other developers to read. So it's add class when, and then we render that out into the component, and it writes out all the values that match the criteria. The API is pretty deep, so you can do a lot of clever things with it. You can pass in function delegates instead of just Boolean flags. There's a lot of room to be creative there, and still it remains pretty readable because of the API. You can do that with styles as well. So you can use Style Builder instead of Class Builder. The difference between Style Builder and Class Builder is Style Builder will add the right delimiters for you. So you don't have to worry about a missing colon or semicolon and doing this all with string interpolation or something like that. It does that all behind the scenes for you, and it's written in a lightweight way using structs, so it's not going to make your components heavy or anything like that. Last thing I want to talk about is frameworks, and then we can dive into some code examples. So there's a couple main frameworks out there these days. Tailwind is one that's gaining popularity. I'll just talk about some of the aspects of it first. Tailwind is generally free to most people. So it offers CSS utilities that are free. The framework itself is free, but there are additional components. I don't even want to call them components. They're more of a compilation of several components that are commercial. So you'll see things like pricing tables. I know if you've ever gone to any website and tried to buy something, there's like a good, better, best tier. So they have that, and it's like a paid thing. So you have that UI that you've purchased. So they have these components and kind of scenarios that you can buy. Those components and things generally use JavaScript. There's some commercial aspects of Tailwind. Their abstraction model is what I like to talk about because I particularly don't care for it. You'll see that there's some pretty verbose class markup that comes out of Tailwind. So we've got things like P something, M something, like there's some number here. Usually it stands for padding and margin. The odd thing about these is usually they correlate to something in CSS that's one-to-one. So it's like I could have just said padding and a number and margin and a number inside of CSS. Don't really understand why I'm doing it all inline in HTML. Some people prefer this model for some reason. It doesn't really fit with how I write code. Also, if I wrote CS code or C# code this way with a P as a variable and you didn't know what P meant or M meant or BG and all these other weird abbreviations, you'd probably be very unhappy using a C# code base with all these weird abbreviations. So kind of don't like it for that aspect as well. But that's my opinion. If you're productive with Tailwind and you love it, keep using it. I think it's a little verbose for me. Another one that kind of caught me off guard is they have a plugin for Visual Studio Code because the class definitions get so large that you cannot parse your HTML visually anymore. So it will put them in an ellipsis for you. So you can expand these giant class tags. That should be a red flag. It's like taking your C# code and wrapping a giant region around it because it's just too long. Not okay to me, but some people love this stuff. So again, if you're productive with it, that's great. Keep using it. I don't want to persuade people off of things they enjoy using. The build system for it has a custom command line, and it uses post CSS internally. So post CSS is very similar to Sass. It's a precompiler for CSS code. It just uses its own proprietary system versus Sass. Then there's Bootstrap. Bootstrap is free. Their components, they have a couple components in there that are free. They used to rely on jQuery. They now rely on just vanilla JavaScript, which is great. But it's still JavaScript, and we're in a .NET world, so they don't really line up that well. They do sell themes for Bootstrap. Not sure how many people are even familiar with that, but there's a big website that they have full of themes that you can get for Bootstrap. Their abstractions are a little less that one-to-one type of a model than Tailwind uses. So they're more utility classes. You still define rows and columns and things using their row and column designators. This is still like kind of getting to be old hat. CSS Grid has been supported by all the major browsers for quite some time now. And it's really easy if you just sit down and learn it. It takes maybe an hour or two to really just understand what CSS Grid is, and then you can kind of throw away all of the Bootstrap layout stuff. You don't need it anymore. The build system for Bootstrap, it used to be Sass, and you can still use Sass with it, but they've gone to CSS variables now in Bootstrap 5. So Sass is no longer their main way of building their library. So you don't need Sass to do massive customization anymore. You can just customize through CSS variables. You can still alternatively use Sass, though, to do additional things if you'd like. But that's starting to, I think, kind of sunset as well for Bootstrap. And then there's the product that I work on. It's totally commercial. There's that slide has a bug and it crashes. I forgot to take it out. We will go directly to our website. So with our Blazor components, they are a commercial product, but there's over 100 components that are very detailed, robust components. There's a data grid that's got sorting, filtering, export, all sorts of capabilities, lazy loading, virtualization, all of that stuff. But the main thing I wanted to show you in regards to customization is we use some of the techniques that I showed you in the slides, where we can customize the appearance of our components. We can theme them using Sass variables. Like I said, we ship Sass code with all of our components if you want it. You can use that, and you can retheme all of the components with Sass. We also have some of those parameters that I talked about. So you can see some of those in action as well. So this is an example of some parameters that we have where you can change kind of the style of a button just by changing one of the properties to fill mode of outline. You can also control the radius of the border radius on that button just by changing rounded to full. And of course, you can select different sizes and whatnot as well. And then here's one of those examples where we have multiple themes for this one component based on it being a button. We have success, failure, error, those type of things. So, your usual red, green, yellow, and so on. So we have that global theming capability, and we also have theming capability at the component itself. So depending on what your needs are, you can style an instance of a component, or you can style all of the components. We can even change the theme right here on the demo website, or you can even start something up called Theme Builder, which is pretty neat. This is a WYSIWYG style editor, and you can jump right in and theme an entire suite of components. Of course, it's going to ask me to log in the middle of presentation. And Theme Builder is actually going to generate behind the scenes Sass code, mostly just variables. So what you can do, for example, is I've got a .NET 7 theme. So when .NET 7 shipped, everybody was super hyped about the new theme of their website. So I went into Theme Builder and set a couple of variables. You can see the variables over here. I can choose my different palettes and things, and this will override all of the color theming for the entire suite of components. So I went in a matter of probably 30 minutes and recreated the .NET 7 website theme for our components. They have that hot pink and purple, and everybody thought it was really cool. So I went in and jumped in and did that real quick as a demo. So that just shows the capabilities that we have with our Blazor applications using CSS and Sass and CSS Isolation. We can put a lot of different things together, manage scope to do complete theming of the entire application, or just kind of focus in on a specific component, give us different themes for that component. I'll leave this up for a second if you want to grab any resources. That's a link to my main website. There's links off of there to my GitHub page. You'll find this presentation on my GitHub repo by the name of the talk. So just search on GitHub, you'll find that. We stream on Twitch all the time. We're on Code It Live, that's our progress channel. We stream about all sorts of software dev topics, and they're not product sales things. Like, we're talking about stuff that you can use on a day-to-day basis, coding techniques, podcasting, stuff like that. We're always on Code It Live doing something fun. And then, of course, check out our stuff at Telerik.com. And then I've got about 10 minutes. So if there's anything in one of the slides that you saw that you want to ask questions about, I can dive into some of the code and take a look, or just a question in general. Just raise your hand and we'll get those. Yes? So the question was, will CSS Isolation create many files based on like how many components probably you're thinking, or will it bundle those all up? So CSS Isolation actually bundles those. The compiler will bundle them all together, and you will find a style sheet linked in your application that will have the namespace of your application, and then it will be called namespace.styles.css, and it bundles everything into that one file. And if I open that up, you'll see that all of the style sheets, or all the component styles, are bundled into this one file. And you can see all of their little GUIDs attached in there, which isolates them from the rest of the application. It's a great question. Anybody else? I'm sorry? Will it minify it? I don't think it gets minified. I have to see if there's a flag in the compiler that I haven't looked into, but I don't believe it gets minified by default. Yes. Yeah, that's so in regards to the Telerik libraries. So if we go to Telerik, here, let's go to Theme Builder. Theme Builder is probably easier to see this. So the question was, let's see, this is the old version. The theme variables that we use, they are using Sass. And we maintain those variables with the same names across versions. So you can reuse those in your application. Let's see if this is... Well, there we go. This one uses the Bootstrap base theme. So you'll see on the left-hand side some of those variable names. That $sign is typical with Sass. So in Sass, instead of double dash that you'd use with CSS variables, Sass uses the $sign. So these are actually Sass variables that you have here. You can actually add your own variables as well. But you can map these to your application and allow it to theme stuff within your application just by using those variable names. One thing that we actually do with Bootstrap is there's a mapping inside of our Sass. So if you're already using Bootstrap and you decide you want to go with our components, Bootstrap's really nice for like prototyping, and they have a couple base components in there. So if you're like, okay, you start off with a data table from Bootstrap, and you're like, I want to upgrade this table to a Telleric grid that has sorting and filtering and paging and all this nice stuff, but you don't want to like redo every component in your entire website. You can bring in our Bootstrap theme, and it will map the variables from Bootstrap to our variables. So if you already have Bootstrap and you've customized some of their Sass variables, it'll draw those in and apply those to our components. So it marries them up. What it's trying to do is make them as seamless with Bootstrap as possible. So it kind of works both ways. You could do either or. Yeah, then the names that are on the left-hand side under colors, body, etc., those are the ones that are being used in our components. There's also variables that you don't see in that left-hand side. We have an upgraded tool for this called Theme Builder Pro, and you can actually scope into a single component as far as you like, and you will see variables in there that pertain to the specific component. So like this one has a button background variable, so you can also utilize those variables too. Any more questions? I think almost at time here. But okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate you coming out. And if you're going to .NET Front End Day, that's Friday, I will have a couple sessions there as well. I think one's a repeat from earlier, or maybe this one. But I have another session on responsive web design that's pretty nice. So if you're going to that, make sure you stop by. Thank you.